Welcome to another episode of Learning for Truth and Love. I really wanted to make sure I had this episode this week and didn't skip it, even though I'm absolutely exhausted. 2 nights ago, the night before, I got very, very little sleep. I had my biggest aha moment that kept me up, and I don't know how long it kept me up because I know it kept me up longer than usual. Even I was surprised that what I discovered was keeping me awake. I thought, oh, this is a really good thing that I'm seeing this. And so then I started mulling in my head about why is this keeping me up? And so what kept me up was wondering why I was being kept up by trying to figure things out. So I'm not saying this and continuing because I just want to prolong, but it's difficult to talk about because, it's one of those things you discover about yourself and you wondered. But I always knew that. I kind of always knew that. I think this time it's almost reframed amidst everything that I'm trying to do and every goal that I'm trying to reach. Okay, so here it is, what I discovered about myself. Don't judge. We're all in different parts and different parts of our journey. We all discover things and moments, and feelings. Okay, so here it is. I discovered the following. There is something else that I like to do better than teaching. And I'm sure there are many other things that I enjoy just as much. But I learned that there's something else I like to do better than teaching, and that is coaching. Now, I always knew that I approached, being an instructor very differently from most people do. And I have been taking a lot of different classes. My most recent endeavor for this past year has been training to be a coach. Now, here's why it's surprising for me. I've been trained to a coach mainly because I landed in a business accelerator program that involved coaching. But then there was a part of me that was wondering, that was doing it for the experience, but not necessarily. And I knew that. And then I started exploring and using some of the coaching approaches this past year. But I don't think I really necessarily thought that that was my goal. Okay. I wanted experience because I really wanted to learn how to build a business and understand what business is about. And so the signs were all there, even with me, hiring and working with coaches and enjoying the experience. So it kept me up at night because I've been doing these things, I've been going down this road and then didn't really realize but that's because this is really what I enjoyed. And this is why when I write about it, I say a lot of times my journey is, internal and external. Sometimes it becomes, external first and then internal, or internal first and then external. And I keep wondering, why didn't I see this or notice earlier? But it makes a lot of sense in hindsight. I just didn't have the realization in this way. So let me just share some of the things I've been doing. I have approached my teaching, I realize, in hindsight, very differently. And every step of the way, everything I've been discovering, and in hindsight, points to the fact that I like to coach better than I, like to just stand up and teach you content. So, and I'm trying to figure out which example to give you because I have such an enormous amount. A lot of what I've realized is that in my teaching experience, I've really sought to give students experiences that I thought would help them to grow from A to B. It's not generally the goal, if you're in a classroom per se, mainly because it's mostly our goal intellectually and cognitively for a particular domain, for particular subject areas. But we don't necessarily think about it as our goal for transformation necessarily as a goal. Now, I didn't necessarily think of it this way, even though kind of was. So let me just stop and give you examples of what I've done. So some of you might know I've taught high school biology for 16 years, and I taught chemistry for a number of years too. And during this process, let me start with the big things. One of the things I've done was I've launched a science fair for students, which I did for years. The science fair, what we would end up doing is the students did projects and they would present their projects. We would close, after the lunch periods, the entire cafeteria. First, it began in the entire cafeteria. And then each year I realized the projects got bigger and bigger, and then I got better. integrating it with the biology and the chemistry courses. It started with the bio courses because that's where I was teaching mostly. And then we moved to the gym, and it was huge. We were talking about over 100 kids. And we're talking about hundreds of kids who, classes would attend the science fair and talk to the students. The students did experiments. And over time, my projects with the students got longer and longer. And I did this because, one, I wanted to give students the experience of doing a type of research. It was hard. It was one of those things that as I was doing it, I was like, wow, this is not sustainable because it's exhausting. I remember one year in particular when I made the project, when I finally figured out how to make it a year-long project where they were engaging and doing each part. And maybe, Fridays we would do the project or things like that. And I fully integrated it with the biology content. So students explored, biology topics. Some students, did topics like, the effects of the brain on learning, and interviewed their fellow students and made up questions. So this was me, integrating qualitative. They did qualitative, quantitative, and they were amazing projects. And I even wrote about it in one of my paper, but I just barely scratched the surface on what I talked about in that paper about exploring data. And you'll see one of my students, some of the posters in that paper. One student even, compared, interviewed teachers and students. Another one, I remember this clearly too, wanted to talk about the environmental effects of drugs and interviewed students. Oh, she was looking at hereditary versus environmental. And she was, I remember us having this conversation. She was surprised by the findings that, I think what she discovered was students did things when they were bored, mostly because of boredom. And so it was an amazing experience. It became a school community experience. And I remember even the student I taught of at was over 60-something% Latinx. And again, Latino Latinx students, Latina are very diverse as well. So you had, Black Latinx as well. And so I've had students, and I'm just going off of what I remember. I remember one student, he, phenotypically, I would say he was Black Latino students. He wanted to study skin color and geographically. So he went around, interviewed students looking at, when we did the unit in genetics. And so what I did was I linked each topic to the science topic, and he interviewed his students to see, I guess, on a continuum, how they would define their color, where they were located geographically, where their families were from. And then one student, I remember her clearly because she really didn't speak as much English, but then she came to me, as teachers, we have these hall duties, and we sat down talking about exploring these malaria data. And so I ended up having these conversations with students, helping them get to A to B, looking at different types of data. And I showed them how to, we talked about asking questions. We talked about independent, dependent variables. Some of them even collected qualitative data and learned how to quantify it. And this, by the way, was the general education population. I didn't teach the honors students. I had general education population, which I loved having because it gave me opportunity to teach students that were more like me in terms of perceptions. And so we did some amazing things. And, the year we made it long was the year I remember seeing students came to me after school, not after school, the following year, right? They would come by and say hi, and they would look so happy and excited. And I was like, wow, because look, I'm a down to business kind of person. I'll be honest, I'm not a small talk person. I've tried sometimes. I shouldn't even say I tried it. Don't even know. Not even sure how. Whenever I need to do small talk, I go and I ask my husband. I speak to my partner about things. It's like, what would you say this? How would you say this? Can you give me an example of a joke I can do in class? I do that because I'm not a small talk person. So what I remembered clearly, students were so excited, even from the year prior, months past. The impact was amazing. But the bottom line is I've been giving students these type of experiences that were transformational. We've had these amazing, those were the positive highlights, I should say, of my teaching because, I have a lot of high expectations when it comes to what I expect students to achieve. So that led to some of the students from that project wanted to do more. Like, I want to do more research. So what it prompted me to do was I applied for NASA SSERV, and we were one of 10 schools to get into this SSERV program. And so it was five young ladies. Was it five or four? One, two, three. We're talking about over 10 years. 10 years ago. And so we ended up being one of 10 schools around the United States to be accepted into the program. And so we did that for a year, and we had a scientist advisor, and I was their mentor, and they did this project, and they did really well in the project. The project ended up being a finalist. So you get only 4 schools are chosen at the end. So we did end up being a finalist among the 4 schools. We didn't win, but we made it to the finalist. They're not your honor students. I love doing things like that. I love showing people what other kids can do, because I think that it's, the biggest difference in what students achieve has to do with the type of guidance. That's my genius, let's just say. That's my genius. That's my zone of genius. And it has been a source of conflict because, my zone of excellence has to do with how I teach the content. I'll give you another example. When I was teaching chemistry, I was asked to attend a state was revamping and trying to connect the standards to the NGSS, the Next Generation Science Standards. And so I was among a group of chemistry teachers throughout the state doing this. And then that was my biggest aha moment. Well, not biggest, one of it, my aha moment then, because I started realizing I was thinking of things differently. And here's how. There's a part of the chemistry standards that talk about patterns. When you read it, there's a lot of interpretations you can make. But I started realizing that the interpretation people frequently make when it comes to the cross-cutting concepts, it's a category of the standards, and one of them is patterns. So these, teachers start talking about how they show students the patterns about, when you're doing periodic table, there are patterns you observe down the groups, across the periods, and all that stuff. And I said, yeah, we would talk about these patterns. And then I realized some people were talking about it as if it was something amazing they were doing. And so I said, well, I have them, because I interpreted it as I have them derive the patterns. And so what I did with my chemistry, and some of this, I still have some of the data. Some students at the end of the year volunteered to give me their books. One of the things I did year after year was I had students, they would give me consent and share their, at the end of the year, they might share their notebook of what they've done. And so I still have this I told myself one day when I have time, if I ever have time, that I will write about these learning experiences. So these students, I gave students exercises where they derived the pattern. It's not something that took a while. It's just the way I designed the lesson, because they have the gift of observation already. They can look and see the pattern, right? And they can tell you what the pattern is. And that's something I had to tell them or teach them, even though we tend to teach them, oh, this is it, because it gives them I don't know. That's just the approach. I took the approach of always teaching students how to learn, helping them to understand how they learn, and have them figure things out. Goodness, sorry. I'm sighing. I'm trying not to sigh in the mic here. So every stage, I have numerous examples in hindsight. It just kept me awake of realizing that I was really coaching as opposed to teaching. I was using the content to coach, but because I was more interested, I think, in coaching, it changed the way I designed and redesigned my lessons. And then when I started realizing I was doing something really different, I started keeping and asking students to let me keep their work at the end of the year, because I used to have them organize it all. And so I promise one day I'm going to go through it. And so I have numerous pictures and all that stuff. So I did that 2 years in a row, and it became a source of friction, because even if it's a great experience where students are getting research experience, I have no doubt that the students who engaged in this project understand research because of how I've coached them into each step. I've also had students who've come back to me, actually not a lot, but one, couple of them have come back to me and say, hey, I remember this from your class while I were in college. But I use that approach because growing up, thinking of the importance of education, what it's for, I felt like I was preparing them for their future, that the goal wasn't just to graduate. college, high school. I was fast forward years now, did the same thing in my approach, not realizing until now that I really was trying to coach without having a coaching experience, but having teaching experience and integrating it with the content. So it led me a lot to focus on skills versus content. And that can be challenging, especially when you have students, even in college, who are used to regurgitating facts. And when you focus on skills, it tends to be very revealing. Like I sometimes discovered things, even in high school, especially when my last year of teaching, I had seniors. And so when you use those approaches, you get to see where students' skill sets may land, or they get to see it too. And it's not always very pleasant because, when you have a vision of yourself and where you are and where you should think you should be, and here I am revealing or telling people, or not telling, never tell. It's just that it discloses where you are. So fast forward later. Well, so let me tell you what I do now. So I was a high school biology teacher for 16 years, and then I became a college professor. Went back and did my doctorate, but was still teaching at the time in the high school. So I became a college professor preparing teachers because of my years of experience. One of the things I encountered from years of preparing teachers there were specific predispositions, especially I prepared elementary ed majors, but I prepared them in STEM. So when I began to see a couple things that I thought needed more a shift in, not a shift in knowledge. And I guess that's what is different too, because most of the times when we teach for knowledge, content, understanding, the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy. When you're thinking differently about it, you often teach for other outcomes, whether it's emotional predispositions. And part of the shift I wanted was really helping teachers as well. I'm preparing teachers to allow students to have those experiences as well, which meant also being comfortable with not knowing. Okay, you're not going to know everything, but you have the predisposition to allow students to have those experiences. And so one of the things I started realizing in reading students' reflections of their, when they observe other elementary teachers teach science was, the outcome was different from, what my goal was. And so I decided to have them observe me teaching little kids. And so at the time I was homeschooling my son, and it ended up being perfect and ideal. I would, engage the homeschoolers and just have us meet online and, I did something where students were able to experience the same units I was teaching as a student. And then they were able to observe me teach the same thing. That way they got to see their reactions and how it was implemented with them and their responses. And they got to see how similar and how, where there were differences when the little kids. And I know I've talked about this before in sharing some of the aha moments, but it really led to having some conversations about our predispositions and how we think about students and position them, because, homeschooling students, they were fairly independent. And so what they needed also, because they're fairly independent and because they can learn, they needed coaching. They didn't need someone to dispel the knowledge. And so we talked about, and again, elementary is very different from teaching high school. And so one of the things I did was we had a science fair for the homeschoolers too, which, a lot of these experiences in general are, I think maybe parents were very impacted. They were very grateful. They talked on about the impact on their kids to have that opportunity, especially to come to a college setting. And I did this in conjunction with another professor who also ran a tutoring program. So we got together and did this. So that was just one example. But I have numerous examples, where I find graduate students and even early faculty. I end up being in a place in a coaching position, and I would end up saying, hey, let's meet. And I realize I enjoy that, meeting with faculty and coaching and helping people to get from A to B, because I've given myself such a vast experience that I can help people to think differently about things and to empower. So I guess that was my biggest goal. My goal was to empower. Wow, I forgot. Didn't even use that word so far, but yes. Throughout, that was my goal. always to empower, so that what I had to offer did matter. And if this wasn't knowledge that ended there, but you had the tools that you could use later on in life. But it also showed me a lot of things. And I want to address this because there's been a lot of conversation about how people feel about college. And look, let me say this, I have a lot of opinions. Not everybody goes to college to be educated and to be transformed. And goals tend to shift depending on, and perceived usefulness tend to shift depending on how we view the exchange of money. So if we're so the experience in college is not just, I mean, even though it does matter in terms of how much money you make. I'm going to save this topic for another time because I have a lot of perspectives on just the skewed views that I see going on out there. And my concern is us going and shifting from one extreme to the other, right? Some of us might know. Wise, we know this because it's a biblical concept. A wise person avoids all extremes. The problem is, in us going from one extreme to the other, we're really forgetting something really important. We're forgetting the purpose. I believe we shift from one extreme to the other because a lot of times it's not just about the purpose. It has to do with the motivated thinking. Sometimes it has to do with ideological shifts. And not everyone values knowledge as much as they value money. And so I think that when we think about our goals, do you want to be transformed or do you just want to stay the same and make more money? And that's something to think about in making your decisions. I really do believe that college is a space where students learn to think, or can learn to think independently. But I also know that, and you see it. You have every perspective, every view voiced, okay, in college. And it's okay to have those different views, hopefully. Depends on what your views are, okay? Depends on what your ideologies are. Anyway, why do I segue into this? I think that I am going to focus on transitioning to the next stages of whatever that means, because my zone of genius is coaching, and my zone of genius is combining teaching with coaching, which allows us to attend to and go beyond simply changes in content subject matter, which, by the way, are also important. But I also think that providing transformative experiences is really, really important for us to shift our thinking in society for those who want to. Not everyone wants to shift their thinking, and not everyone wants to be transformed. And so not everyone wants to, we all have to define what that transformation means for us, especially in the college setting. So thank you for joining. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed or learned anything or appreciated anything about today, hopefully it was helpful to you. Please like and follow, and so you can be informed for the next episode. And we're going to mix this in with having guests as well so that we can have these other conversations. Thank you for joining today.